George Hamilton was once the embodiment of silver screen charm, known for his golden tan, high-profile romances, and an air of effortless class. But today, at 85, the man who once walked red carpets with presidents' daughters and shared private dinners in the White House now faces a reality no spotlight can soften. His health has deteriorated. The cancer that once receded has returned, more aggressive than ever. His once grand fortune has slipped through his fingers, and the mansion he called home for decades is now up for sale. The glitz is gone. What remains is a man fighting a quiet battle far from the flashes of paparazzi. The same George Hamilton who once defined elegance now finds himself struggling to pay his medical bills. Born in Memphis in 1939, George was the product of two vastly different worlds. His father, a charismatic northern band leader, and his mother, a southern belle with fire in her spirit. It was a blend of rhythm and refinement that would eventually shape George's iconic persona. His early life was anything but stable. Constant moves, driven by his father's band tours, taught him to adapt quickly, to blend in and charm at will. He wasn't the oldest or the baby. He was the middle child, often overlooked but silently observing everything. Then came the turning point that reshaped his entire trajectory. In 1944, George's father abandoned the family after an affair with a singer in his band. George was just 5 years old. The family fell apart. His father vanished into the New York business world, trading his trumpet for perfume sales. He died young, and George never really got to say goodbye. From there, life became about survival. The glamour of hotels and bandstands was replaced with the silence of Arkansas, where George and his brothers were sent to live with their grandparents. It was a brief period of peace, structured, warm, and filled with old Southern values. But it didn't last. In 1947, both grandparents passed away. Suddenly, there was no safety net. Their mother, without support or savings, was left with 3 boys and a coin. That coin toss, heads for New York, tails for Hollywood, sealed George's fate. It landed on Hollywood, and just like that, an 8-year-old boy packed up his life and headed west into the unknown. California offered dreams, but not guarantees. By 1950, they had moved again, this time to the East Coast. George floated between schools until finally enrolling at Gulf Coast Military Academy in Mississippi. There, something shifted. The strict discipline, the posture drills, the high expectations. It all played into the persona George would later perfect. Polished, charming, and unshakably composed. He stood out not because he tried to, but because he couldn't help it. But even as he stood tall in public, there were shadows behind the scenes. His home life was fractured. A troubled relationship with his stepmother began haunting him long before his teen years, a private wound he carried in silence for decades. Then, in 1958, everything changed. With no formal training, just the memory of winning a high school drama contest and sheer presence, George landed a screen test at MGM. He was broke, inexperienced, and out of his depth. But he had something they couldn't ignore. MGM wasn't enthusiastic at first. The role in Crime and Punishment USA was supposed to go to Anthony Perkins. George was the backup, an afterthought. But when the cameras rolled, he stunned them. His portrayal of a guilt-ridden student teetering between intellect and insanity earned him a Golden Globe and a BAFTA nomination. He didn't just act, he absorbed the role. That performance should have launched him into stardom. Instead, he found himself still begging for parts, even bribing TV producers with whiskey just to get on screen. But George was clever. He knew charm alone wouldn't keep him relevant. That's when he made a decision that would define his image. He started tanning. Not just a summer bronze. This was a deep, deliberate tan that set him apart from every other leading man. It was risky, but it worked. The tan became his signature. a conversation starter, a punchline, a brand. He and fellow actor John Derek even playfully competed over who could get darker. George embraced it, leaned into it, and used it to stay visible, even when the offers dried up. Then came Where the Boys Are in 1960, a sun-drenched romantic college flick where George played a smooth-talking rich boy. It was a departure from the political tones of the original novel, but the film clicked with audiences. George improvised a now-famous moment in the sand, tracing a question mark beside his co-star's face. It was cheesy. It was perfect. And it made him a heartthrob overnight. Critics dismissed it, but audiences felt differently. Over time, scholars even began to see that performance as part of a cultural shift, one that reflected changing ideas about gender, romance, and identity in post-war America. By 1965, George's star rose high enough to catch the attention of the most powerful family in the country. His role as Hank Williams led to an invitation to the White House, where he met Linda Bird Johnson. She was everything he wasn't: bookish, quiet, steeped in tradition. But somehow they clicked. It was an unlikely pairing, but one that took the nation by storm. They appeared together at high-profile events, holidayed in Acapulco, and even stole the spotlight at the Academy Awards. Bob Hope joked that she didn't need a watch. She had a Hamilton. But behind the glamour, trouble brewed. President Lyndon B. Johnson didn't trust him. He saw George not just as an actor, but as a potential threat. Quietly, he ordered an FBI probe into George's life. Nothing criminal surfaced, but the investigation was personal. Deep dives into his family, finances, even unconfirmed rumors. In an era when reputation was everything, the scrutiny was suffocating. Then came the most surreal moment: a hunting trip at the president's ranch. George was summoned without warning, no explanation. Just a rifle, a stare, and the pressure to prove himself. He passed the test, barely. But the tension didn't end there. Whispers about draft evasion began to swirl. George had claimed he supported his family to avoid Vietnam service, but with his mother living lavishly in Beverly Hills, the excuse didn't hold. The president, already furious over the war, made his stance clear. If George wanted to be part of the first family, he couldn't dodge his duty. The pressure became unbearable. By the end of 1966, the romance dissolved. But George didn't disappear. When Linda married a Marine in 1967, George arrived with a smile, flashing his signature charm as cameras rolled. He didn't crash the wedding. He stole the moment like only George Hamilton could. He always stayed connected to them, even when life took unexpected turns. Years after their romance had faded from the tabloids, George Hamilton still found himself circling the lives of Rob and Linda. When Rob became the governor of Virginia, George didn't just hear about it from the news. He was there, watching, remembering, and quietly wondering what might have been. In his memoir, George later confessed that during the inauguration, a small voice inside him whispered, "That could have been me." It wasn't bitterness, just a haunting thought that lingered. Time moved on, but the past never truly loosened its grip. By 2012, the couple came to watch George perform in Washington, D.C., and even invited him over for dinner. There was no fanfare, just an old thread being gently tugged. George never became a president's son-in-law, but for a brief, astonishing moment, he stood on that edge, closer than any Hollywood heartthrob had ever dared. By the late 70s, George's name didn't shine the way it used to. He was no longer the golden boy of Hollywood, and the roles had slowed. But just when it seemed like the curtain might fall, a quirky vampire comedy flipped everything. In 1979, Love at First Bite hit theaters, and Hamilton wasn't just the star, he co-produced the project. Expectations were low, but George? He went all in. Instead of portraying Count Dracula with a straight face, he turned the role on its head, campy, witty, and unapologetically bizarre. Disco tunes, punchlines, and vampire flair turned the film into a cult classic. Audiences didn't just laugh, they remembered him. And just like that, Hollywood saw a new George Hamilton emerge. Still charming, but now hilarious, inventive, and surprisingly savvy behind the scenes. That same unpredictability followed him off-screen. In 1972, George's life veered straight into a romantic whirlwind that could have been plucked from a screenplay. While hanging out with Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager, his then-girlfriend Alana Collins stopped by to collect her things before heading to London. In a moment of spontaneous madness, Parker suggested they get married right then. And they did. On Elvis's private jet, in Elvis's suite, with a judge waiting and a little dog acting as maid of honor, they tied the knot. They even gambled afterward. George lost $15,000 but came home with a wife. Their story had started in Acapulco, where sparks flew, and not always in the good way. But a few quarrels, one slap, and some undeniable chemistry later, they found themselves wrapped in a romance neither expected. 2 years later, they welcomed their son, Ashley. For someone famously labeled as a Hollywood playboy, George embraced fatherhood with quiet sincerity. When he shot Medusa in Greece, he brought his family along, turning the gig into a sun-soaked honeymoon. Ashley would go on to follow in his dad's footsteps, appearing in films like Beethoven's Second and Iron Man 3. Even after George and Alana's marriage ended in 1975, their story didn't dissolve. They raised Ashley together and remained a family, one that even included Alana's children from her later marriage to Rod Stewart. It wasn't traditional, but it worked. They stayed best friends. They shared dinners, daily phone calls, even rides. Because George was always late, and Alana had long accepted that. People joked they should remarry, but the bond they had surpassed titles. As George once put it, he didn't miss the marriage. He missed her. Then, just as his career had started to stabilize, another unexpected chapter began. In 1979, while promoting Love at First Bite in the Philippines, George was invited to lunch at the presidential palace. That meal introduced him to Imelda Marcos, and what followed was more than a friendship. It was a whirlwind of travel, glamour, and mystery. The First Lady of the Philippines was charmed by George's wit and charisma, and soon they were inseparable. Jet-setting across continents, sharing music, shopping extravagantly. On the surface, it looked like a curious celebrity friendship. But beneath it, something more troubling was brewing. George soon met Antonio Florendo, a Marcos associate, and Glitzy Tantoco, Imelda's confidant. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were central to a labyrinth of secret transactions and questionable deals. In 1982, Florendo loaned George $600,000, supposedly to refinance a Mississippi plantation. But suspicions grew, especially when $12 million was found to have moved through Hamilton's accounts. In one instance, he even flew to Hong Kong to collect $5.5 million. Money that prosecutors believed came straight from the Philippine treasury. The timing was damning, especially since George had just attended the lavish Manila Film Festival, an event dripping in excess. That same year, Hamilton began upgrading his Beverly Hills home. A new garage, expanded rooms, the works. There were whispers that the house itself wasn't even truly his, but a Marcos property tucked under his name. Investigators believed the money fueled the renovation. The web only thickened when Hamilton announced a movie about General MacArthur. Originally pitched as a war epic, the project evolved under pressure from Imelda's circle into a romantic tale about MacArthur's supposed love for a Filipina woman. George was mortified. I Shall Return was no longer a military vow. It was romantic fluff. Eventually, the project was abandoned, and the millions were discreetly returned. But the damage lingered. By 1988, George's name surfaced in a federal indictment as an unindicted co-conspirator. He wasn't formally charged, but his reputation took a hit. He claimed innocence, insisting he was just a friend and never involved in business dealings. But the evidence painted a cloudier picture. He had accepted millions. He testified. He kept defending the Marcoses even as they were accused of siphoning over $100 million from their own people. His legal team argued he was a Southern gentleman, too polite to dig deeper. George claimed he had no idea where the money came from and returned it when suspicions arose. But even Floerendo later admitted it was Imelda who orchestrated everything. Hamilton's house? Possibly part of her empire. George said he was used, but not knowingly. Yet, the headline stuck. He always knew how to leave a mark, not just on film but on every room he walked into. Even now, George Hamilton's life feels like a Hollywood script nobody had the nerve to write. There was that one note Elizabeth Taylor gave him that read, "Dearest George, I love you even though you are an asshole." It was so her, funny, blunt, and warm all at once. To George, it wasn't just a punchline. It was proof of their unbreakable bond. Elizabeth, with all her sparkle and steel, was unforgettable, and George carried her spirit long after the flashbulbs dimmed. But Liz wasn't the only stunning woman orbiting his sun-soaked world. In a 2009 TV moment, George casually mentioned that he dated 4 Miss World winners. No names, just enough mystery to ignite 1,000 dinner conversations. That was classic George, dropping bombs in silk gloves. In the 60s and 70s, George was everywhere. He moved through the glamour of the era like it was tailored just for him. Red carpets, studio backlots, glossy spreads, always with a beauty by his side and a tan brighter than the California sun. Even Burt Reynolds couldn't resist taking a jab. He once handed George a card with a mashup of Tony Curtis and Anthony Perkins labeled, "To George, love Mom and Dad." George loved it so much he carried it around like a trophy. But not all of George's romances were flings wrapped in punchlines. In 1995, he met 20-year-old model Kimberly Blackford while he was 56. Hollywood didn't blink. It was George being George. But this time, it stuck. For 4 years, they stayed together and welcomed a son, George Thomas Hamilton, known as GT. George didn't marry Kimberly, but he never drifted. GT was raised with structure and values. Military school, manners, discipline. Just like George had done with his first son, Ashley. But his road wasn't always lined with roses. As a kid, George contracted measles, which robbed him of hearing in his left ear. He kept it hidden for decades until a close friend, screen icon Gloria Swanson, told him to fly to Switzerland for an experimental treatment. It was painful, expensive, and under the radar. But it worked. Within weeks, George regained nearly all his hearing, as if defying biology was just another role to master. Years later, he faced an even graver threat. His heart valve was failing. At 86, most would retreat. George charged forward, underwent surgery, and walked out of the hospital in 2 days. His recovery stunned his doctors. Kale shakes, almonds, and strict discipline turned him into a living case study. And then, true to form, George spun adversity into enterprise. The sun worshipper, known for tanning beds and bronze skin, decided to launch his own skincare line. Yes, really. The George Hamilton skincare system promised to reverse sun damage with overnight miracles. Dermatologists cringed, but consumers couldn't buy fast enough. He turned malls into runways, offering champagne and charm alongside serums. His line grossed over $4 million in the first year alone. Yet as quickly as it rose, it faded, overshadowed by the next celebrity craze. If his story left you smiling, curious, or just plain amazed, go ahead and tap that like button. Drop your favorite George moment in the comments, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into Hollywood's most legendary lives. Trust us, what's coming next will surprise you. And remember, if George taught us anything, it's this. Life's a stage, so wear your best smile. And maybe a little SPF. Until next time, stay curious and keep the spotlight shining.